Okay, now to the other topic of landfills. Historically, landfills were supposed to be convenient and inexpensive option. However, that has changed today with creating what you call the sanitary landfills. They cost anywhere from 100 to 300 million dollars. Please write that number down. And there's always tipping fees. Tipping fee is basically the fee required, the cost of dumping in that particular area. So there's a reason why Bridgeport allows for a landfill in their neighborhood, because if Stamford wants to send their trash to Bridgeport, they have to pay Bridgeport for it. And these can run in the millions typically. There has, in the past couple of years, with all the number of housing developments we've had, land has actually become pretty scarce. There's also building a sanitary dump is not actually that easy. I keep calling it dump. I should call it a waste management site. Is also not that easy. It requires a lot of like government permits, a lot of permits from the EPA, a lot of quote unquote regulation that makes a small business owner cannot start landfill all willy-nilly everywhere. Besides that, there's a lot of community backlash that happens whenever a landfill is created. This is called the Nimby Factor and the Nymphy Factor, which is not in my backyard or not in my front yard. Everybody wants to find a solution for all the trash and the waste stream we create. However, we do not want it in our own neighborhood. If you go more towards like Hartford and Enfield and Manchester and those places, there is large open areas. I don't know, what is it called, like eastern, no, northern Connecticut, I guess. There's large vast open areas that can be used. However, those neighborhoods are larger tax-paying bases, so they don't allow for that kind of establishment in their neighborhood. But I think there might be one in Enfield. I may be wrong on that. However, there are a few good things that have been happening because of these landfills. There's a lot of methane recovery. Anytime you have a ton of organic material in one place, one of the gas they tend to react with each other, and one of the gases they produce is methane gas. This is it's a very volatile gas. It burns really, really fast. It has a high flash point. This is again, like it says, these are chemical reactions because of various trash components. The trash components here being organic material. There's also going to be a lot of microbial action. Most of the food products you throw away, a landfill is a theme park for all, everything from salmonella to clostridium. Those are bacteria, different types of bacteria. However, certain landfills are doing this thing where they're recovering this gas, the methane gas, and using it in homes. So it kind of offsets the cost of coal. So you're essentially using a form of natural gas. Some of the states that are doing an amazing job of doing this is actually Connecticut, New Jersey, and New York. New York actually has an ordinance that prohibits any kind of fracking in their state, which is very ironic because they also are one of the bigger users of natural gas, which is a product of fracking as of now. However, if we are able to use the methane gas that's produced by the landfills effectively, we could offset the amount of fracking that is done. And this is slightly cheaper to produce because most of it is microbial action that we don't have to do anything with. It is cheaper to produce, however, it is still more expensive to collect and distribute. So once we come up with an easier method to do this, it it would actually solve a lot of our trash problem. However, methane gas is a very stinky gas. So again, the NIMBY and the Nimby factor comes in. In most countries, I know this happens in India a lot because my family, we are farmers. Um, Farmers is a very loose term. Um, so we have a ton of cows and buffaloes and basic livestock. Most of the manure that's collected from them is not actually used in farms because we grow coffee and we don't need that kind of manure. Um, these are actually put into individual biogas reactors. So in most family homes in like India and stuff like that that actually have livestock, you have something called as a, I'm going to write that word down because you're going to need it. It's called a biogas reactor. They take in most of the household trash is put in there, a lot of livestock waste material is put in there, and over a period of time, it actually produces a lot of methane gas. Collection and distribution, there's usually a huge tank on top of it that collects this gas, and then the gas is circulated through pipelines for cooking and for electricity and all of that stuff. Since it's done on a small scale basis, it's not as expensive. However, if you were doing it on a larger scale basis, it gets exponentially expensive. And distribution also becomes a little more expensive because it has to go through pipelines. Millions of miles of pipelines has to be laid down, and it has to travel through that, which can be a little more expensive. Fracking and using this a method, a way of doing this could be if we were allowed, if methane gas was allowed to use the same network of pipelines that we have for the gas lines in your house, it might be cheaper. However, those are two different types of gases. So there is a little bit of volatility issue there. Um, so once we're able to figure out the distribution as well as the store or the collection and the distribution part of it, it might actually work out to be cheaper. Besides that, it also has another effect. Methane gas is one of the huge contributors to greenhouse gases, and when you have an open dump, you are putting millions and millions of metric tons of methane gas into the atmosphere. If we can actually collect it and harness it, that would actually be an amazing thing for not only our environment, also our bottom line in the long run. Um, One of the most preferred ways that we use right now is incineration. We tend to take most of our like paper waste, sometimes even plastic waste that we take and we actually burn it. Um, it's a great way to get rid of it in size. Obviously, there is ash created, but you are getting rid of it in size. Burning this trash, the heat collected from it is actually used to heat up public buildings, and is also used a certain amount in generating electricity. It's used to like for turbines and stuff like that. However, there is a huge problem with that. That is the emissions from these things. There's huge amounts of heavy metals, dioxins, furans that are actually put into the atmosphere. So there is a great component of air pollution that happens because of this. You also have a large amount of ash that's created. This ash is also toxic. When you mix ash with water, you make a lye, which is actually very caustic. It's sodium hydroxide, which is neither a very, which is not a good idea to have in your backyard anyways. Plastic and metals need to have larger flash points, so they tend to burn at very, very high temperatures and also create large amounts of waste. Burning of plastic is pretty much a carcinogenic. It creates this huge toxic plume, which is not a good idea either. Um, and like it says, intentionally, there are well over 1,000 such waste to energy plants that reduce garbage while generating much needed heat. They do generate heat, they do reduce garbage, but they also increase air pollution. So while incineration has its benefits, it also has its downfall. It it produces heat, which is used for heating up mostly public buildings. It's also used in terms of reducing the mass of waste, but it really doesn't. It also unfortunately puts in a lot of heavy metals into the air. So if you're living next to an incinerator of trash, you're looking at breathing some really very good gases that Putin would be envious about. Dioxins was one of the things that Putin uses uh, Putin allegedly uses as his preferred choice of poisoning people. So you'd be living near gas, near pollutants that would put Putin to shame. But oh, at least the trash mountain is reduced. Now, when they do burn these things, there is something called as refuse-driven fuel, where they actually do sort out and remove the recyclables and the unburnable materials. So something like plastic is actually removed from this content. This is done, so there's different types of incinerators. There are incinerators that basically burn everything down to an ash, and that is the one that produces a lot more pollutants. However, there are other things. There are other things where they're more discriminatory, where they remove the unburnable materials, they remove the recyclables, like a rubber tire would be removed because it can be recycled and made into other things. But whereas if you had a large stack of paper, that would burn away. Whereas when if it's a mass burn, which is the second type, which is the one which is what we were talking on the previous slide, where everything is burnt down, it obviously creates a lot more air pollution. It does reduce the disposable volume to a great extent. However, again, like I talked about earlier, the ash that's left over is very, very concentrated and very, very toxic. Um, it has to be at all points of time covered and kept away from water, because if you add ash with water, you get sodium hydroxide, and that is not good for anyone. And if you let sodium hydroxide seep into the groundwater, it not only contaminates the groundwater, it also makes the soil very, very alkaline, which can be a huge problem for a lot of agriculture. For example, in California, you couldn't grow 90% of the things that they grow in the Central Coast and the Central Valley. You would be able to grow things that in Southern California, because our soil is anyway alkaline, but Central Valley, you would not be able to grow anything, because once the soil becomes alkaline, that's pretty much a forever thing.